It was an ordinary day, the sun was shining, and inside James there was a struggle with despair. The desperation was due to the fact that he only had money left to go to the store a couple of times. But besides this, he had to pay the rent. Otherwise, he would live on the street. Suddenly, the main character saw a sign of a lottery stall. Thinking that he had nothing to lose, he went there with little hope. When James bought some tickets, he saw some percentages on top of them, which was a little confusing. But a moment later, he realized that these were winning percentages, and was so surprised by this that he almost choked on his own saliva. Therefore, the guy asked the owner for more, which greatly surprised him. But still, he gave him more. After a series of wins, James gained inspiration, and the despair that had previously suffocated him was gone, because he now had nowhere to turn from. At the same time, there was a certain worm of doubt in him that was gnawing at him inside, that he could not win so easily, and there must be some kind of catch. Nevertheless, the entire amount he won came to his card, which could not but rejoice. Now he had money for some time. James didn't want to stop, so he asked the owner again, with disbelief in his eyes. But he nevertheless gave him a new portion of tickets. Seeing his winnings, the owner almost had a heart attack right at the counter. He refused to believe it. The main character noted to himself that of course the owner would soon give up on his winnings, but he didn't need that. Having gotten away with the innocent excuse that he was often lucky in gambling and he understood all its dangers, James again asked for new tickets. Starting to wash off the coating, the guy did not understand what was happening, because there was again and again a call to try again. As he continued to erase the tickets one by one, he thought that his ability to see winning percentages was gone. Sighing with relief, the owner was already happy that he had sold so many tickets, but he still did not believe such a lucky buyer. Having noticed the percentages that did not disappear, James finally realized that the ability did not disappear anywhere, and he was too carried away and did not notice them. The guy saw a large percentage in one of the tickets and asked to buy another one. Theatrically calling upon all the forces of earth, water, fire, and wind, he began to erase the protective film, and an incredible miracle happened. According to the owner, James won a very large sum. Hiding behind the shop, the owner still could not believe such terrible luck and realized that selling him tickets could turn out to be a profitable business. So he offered James more tickets and said that if he lost, he would keep 20% of the winnings for himself. But the main character realized what was happening, and therefore said that he had used up all his luck for today and headed for the door. He said along the way that he would look here perhaps tomorrow and try his luck again. Just for fun, James decided to see the chance of opening the door. At first it was 100%, but then it began to fall rapidly. As it turned out, a seemingly rabid dog flew through the glass door, scaring not only him, but everyone around him with its mayhem. The guy wanted to leave and further deal with his problems, some of which had already been resolved, when suddenly the owner's voice stopped him. He took him by the shoulder and looked in surprise, and also asked how he knew that an animal would fly into the door. James was not taken aback and began to say that he is a psychic, and thanks to a technique passed down from generation to generation, he can see the future. Of course, the owner was in no hurry to believe him, and if he had such abilities, then why nothing was heard about him? Realizing that he would not be able to convince the owner with this, he began to go through the continuation of his lies, checking which of the options he would be more willing to fall for. With a completely serious face, he said that if his power had been discovered earlier, bad people could have used it for their own purposes, and then invited the owner to check it. The owner was shocked by this, and therefore said that his house was destroyed by a natural disaster, and he would like to receive compensation. Calling on all his strength, James asked exactly how much the owner could get for the house and land. Realizing that the owner would be able to get several million for his destroyed property, he suggested checking it out right away. Having dialed the number on the phone, the owner did not believe it until the last moment, but after a few minutes he seemed to drop out. Having come to his senses, the owner was very happy with such news and promised James that he would give part of the money from the compensation as gratitude. The happy owner and the no less happy protagonist finally parted on such a good note. Coming out of the stall, the guy saw the dog that had caused chaos with his arrival, lying right on the road. Approaching her, James decided to check her chance that she was looking for the owner. It was 100%. He did not expect that the dog would suddenly take the ball lying next to it and throw it. It began to bounce off the walls and store signs. The toy returned to the animal, but when it returned, it hit James painfully and flew into the thrower's head. But the adventures with the lost one seemed to have just begun, because she didn't want the main character to leave, so she bit him on the leg. After his attack, the dog demolishing everyone and everything in its path, James had no choice but to run after it. The lost man and the victim ran to a beautiful park, which was located in the center of the city, and they saw a girl ahead. Having called her, the guy was very amazed by her beauty and serenity. She had time to take selfies, but didn't have time to look after her dog. So they talked a little, and it turned out that she was completely sure that her dog was there. But then she wondered why he brought her back, even though she was tied to the bench. At these words, James pointed to the place of the leash, and the girl saw that the collar was torn and the dog was not in place. After which she began to apologize profusely and suggested exchanging social networks so that they could take a walk together in the future. After the incident with the dog, James wandered down the street and thought about how he could make money on his ability. And quite unexpectedly, he made his way to the local market, where they sold everything that could be sold at a higher price, including antiques. Passing by, a bunch of merchants called him in the hope that they could trick him around their finger and make a big jackpot out of it. Everywhere they tried to catch James in their net, because they saw that a newcomer had come to them who knew nothing. He stopped at one of the merchants to look at his goods and check what chance this or that item would have. His attention was drawn to one bracelet lying among a pile of other junk. It had an old and shabby appearance, but the price for it was lower than the stated price. Walking further down the street, James's attention was attracted by a merchant with the same pile of old junk, but with different things. After talking with the owner, he saw one green bowl and, using his ability, learned that its value was more than several $100,000. He didn't want to lose such a jackpot for almost nothing. When out of curiosity he reached $500,000, the main character was full of joy. Full of joy and confidence in the great price of the cup, James began talking about it with the owner, trying to bring down the price. The owner of the bowl was very surprised as to why he had it, and wondered whether the bowl was really worth that much. While he was tormented by these questions, which had no answer at the moment, he decided to distract him by offering another product in the form of a fragile clay vase. James in turn did not want to deviate from his plans and, saying that he was not very interested in this, but that it was that green bowl that was interesting, nevertheless negotiated a lower price from the owner. The slightly upset owner nevertheless agreed to it, noting to himself that any profit would not make his pocket worse, and reluctantly packed the purchase. Having said goodbye, James continued to walk around the market, and the owner began to talk to himself about the past trade. Having said that, after all, any profit pleases both the soul, the pocket, and the heart. But his monologue was interrupted by a neighbor who was very surprised by this. Then a girl approached the merchant and asked about the cup they had agreed on yesterday. She was beautiful and was surprised that she was no longer there, and asked if she should raise the price so that the merchant would return the thing to her. The owner was very surprised by such pressure and was already beginning to wonder if he had sold that bowl to the boy for next to nothing. The girl already began to have doubts about her little thing, and she began to suspect that he might not find it at all. She decided to take a chance, saying that she would double the original price if only he would return the cup. Then the owner finally remembered yesterday's girl and her price, and was ready to slap himself in the face for his memory, because the price was high before, and now it has become even higher. The beauty already wanted to throw a scandal about this, and she cared little about who, how, and why he took the cup somewhere, just so that it would be returned as soon as possible. The owner's heart bled tons of blood for selling the item to the boy so cheaply, and cursed himself for such inattention. His neighbor was practically crying with laughter, seeing his comrade in such despair, and said that he had never allowed himself to do this before, let alone now. Suddenly, the girl recoiled from the counter and stepped back a little, without understanding what was ultimately happening. The reason for this was the owner, who was already rolling on the ground out of grief, and was ready to bury himself in the same place, just to forget about such a major mistake. Resigned to the fact that she couldn't get the cup from him, the girl asked where the buyer of her loss had gone. Not far from them, they heard active voices. There was an auction for a rare bowl. The girl thought that perhaps this was her thing, and with a small amount of hope, she headed in their direction. As it turned out, it was James, and he was trying to inflate the price of an old man who seemed to be knowledgeable about antiques. Having heard the price of the second one, the girl added several thousand to its price, in the hope that the man would give in to her. She noted to herself that although it looked familiar, the cup had to be returned at any cost. Otherwise, her grandfather would be very upset. But James wanted the price even higher, so he waited for the man to make his move. But the girl did not let up and said that whoever offered the higher price takes the item. The old man, who wanted to buy the cup, suddenly said that it looked familiar, and did he happen to know Professor Collins? The beauty said that this was her grandfather, and that she did not immediately understand who he was, but her ancestor told about him, how they worked together. James was already losing patience and said that if no one took the cup, he would go somewhere else and sell it there. The girl immediately transferred the last amount told to her and took the much-desired item. But the main character did not want to leave the beauty just like that, and therefore offered her a little fortune-telling as a thank you. The girl decided that he was some kind of abnormal person and hurried to leave as quickly as possible before no one discovered her disappearance. James didn't want to just leave her, so he decided that it was better to continue. Suddenly it would break, but the beauty was already tired of him and exclaimed how dare he pester a woman who is older than him and still busy. The decision not to retreat to the last was stronger than the fear of a hidden threat, so he decided to test it all. The first thing the main character did was find out whether she had a husband or boyfriend. As it turned out, she didn't. And the second thing he decided to do was find out whether she was really older than him or not. As it turned out, she wasn't. Joyful and happy, he wanted to jump from the information he received, saying to himself, "It's nice to learn other people's secrets." But he was pulled out of this joy by the already leaving girl and decided that this was the last chance to leave her attention, to tell her the exact date of birth. She was wary of this information and already began to think that some stalker was trying to deceive her in order to do something with her later. The people watching this whole performance were also surprised by this, and their thoughts partially coincided with the thoughts of the beauty. James immediately realized that he shouldn't have thrown it all away like that. Now he might be considered not only a strange weirdo, but also some kind of stalker pervert. But to check all this, the girl suddenly pulled out the phone from her pocket and dialed someone. She decided to ask her mother the exact date of her birth, to which she replied that she would now look at the medical record. A woman's voice answered on the phone with exactly the same date as the guy who was stuck to her had said. This shocked her very much. With disbelief in her voice, the girl asked how he knew her date of birth so accurately if they had not met before. James replied that this is an ancient extra-science technique that helps you find out about a person just by looking at him. After all this, the girl no longer had patience and was ready to attack the guy with her fists, if only he would shut up and leave him behind. Here a strange involuntary question arose in the main character's head, whether this girl hates men. What the ability showed was 100%, and it couldn't help but shock him. One way or another, he achieved what he wanted. Contacts were exchanged, and he found out that her name was Gladys. Joyful at this outcome of events, James went home humming something under his breath. Involuntary questions arose in his head again about Gladys, whether her parents would call her and whether it would be her mother. The ability immediately overwhelmed him with signs with 100% in front of his eyes and decided that it was better to notify her of such an event. Before Gladys had time to move away from the scene, she suddenly heard her phone begin to vibrate in her pocket. Taking it out from there, she unlocked the screen and couldn't figure out who the message had just come from because there were a lot of them. But having found a fresh one, I saw that it was from a new friend who wrote that one of her parents would call her soon. She ran out of the alley she was in and began to look with her eyes where this man was, so as to know that he was definitely not following her. Meanwhile, James was already thinking about how lucky he was today, not only with discovering his ability, but also with girls. At that moment, Gladys received a call, and it was from her mother. The girl was very scared from surprise. The woman on the other end said that she wanted her to come back and they needed to talk. At the same time, James was also frightened by the sudden call and almost dropped it from his hands. As it turned out, it was already his mother, and she asked him to return, and she had a conversation with him. After these words, he ran like an arrow down the street, demolishing random passers-by. In the evening, the main character sat in a restaurant and calmly drank coffee, thinking about the words of his mother, who set him up on a blind date. They gave him a photograph of a beauty. He looked at her and thought that she probably had a lot of guys, and most likely she was also going on a blind date. The door opened and two girls entered the room, one of whom was Gladys, and the other was the same beauty from the picture. For some reason, the first stopped the second, saying that this was a bad idea, and it was better to abandon it before it was too late. Looking at this picture, James decided to check the percentage of their acquaintance. He almost choked when he found out that the girls knew each other 100%. Having freed herself from her friend's arms, the beauty said that her name was Cheryl, and immediately after suggested we meet. From such an offer around instant, there was silence, and everyone, including James, was amazed at how seriously she said this. But this didn't bother Cheryl at all, and, not allowing the guy to recover from the shock of what was said, she whispered that he didn't want to go with her after the restaurant. Without allowing James to comprehend everything, she pressed herself close and hugged him, saying that this was the kind of guy she dreamed of and that this day would be the best of her life. Still not understanding what was happening, the main character was only more amazed and was even more shocked by an unexpected kiss from the beauty. Meanwhile, Gladys, who was watching this whole picture, was not only in shock, but felt a strange feeling inside her. She felt abandoned by the whole world and her friend, who, without listening to her persuasion, nevertheless decided to contact this guy. James realized that something was wrong here, but decided to take her word for it and not test it with his ability. The two did not pay any attention to those around them or to the girl, who had already run away somewhere. And Cheryl said that if James was already ready, then they were going to her right away. Upon entering the apartment, the girl immediately introduced the newcomer to her mother, who reacted quite violently to him. The guy thought to himself that since there was such a reaction to him, then he must be the first guy whom the beauty brought home. With his head in the clouds, he did not notice how her father grabbed him and dragged him forcefully into the room. Sitting James down next to his daughter, he said that he and his mother would not disturb them and they could do what they wanted. The guy noted to himself that it was nice to be the first where no one had been, but he still had doubts that this was some kind of performance for the parents. Meanwhile, the mother and father whispered and began to discuss that if the young man brought by his daughter would do her harm, to which the head of the family, with a cleaver in his hand, said, "Let him just try." At this moment, those in the room started talking about everything that was happening, because James said that he felt like he had already been kidnapped by a person. Cheryl walked away from him, and he did the same. She said that otherwise her parents would torment her until her death, with the question of when she would finally bring a guy into the house. The beauty admitted that she is not going to force him to do anything. She just wants this issue to stop being a headache for her, thinking that she was right about something, and having checked with the help of his ability whether he could hug her, and began to slowly approach her, when out of the blue he fell. Hearing the noise, the girl's father immediately burst into the room waving a cleaver and asked what kind of noise was suddenly made. Seeing James kneeling in front of Cheryl and her surprised face, he didn't understand why there was a pogrom. Apologizing, the girl's mother pulled her husband out of the room by the ear and, closing the door behind her, told them not to stop what they were doing and to continue. The main character did not understand what was happening at all and was already beginning to regret that he had agreed to participate in this performance. But after this, he was overcome by despondency and fear that if he failed, her father might settle scores with him in a cruel way. Cheryl apologized for the incident and asked if he would help her with the matter without any obligation, to which James replied that he did not want to participate in all this and deceive his parents in such a matter, and left the room, where the older members of the family were already rushing to him. Hearing the girl's mother's apology about his sneakers, he felt such shock and disappointment that even for the entire day, his emotions were just specks of dust. His favorite shoes were ruined and soaked from soup spilled on them, according to the owner, who continued to apologize. The girl's father invited him to stay overnight, and while he was here they would dry out, but saying that he needed to visit a relative in the hospital, he left, slamming the door behind him. Having left this strange family, he rented a room and went to bed, thinking about today and that he should try his luck in that market tomorrow. The next day, James went there to get some new antiques and some new money. The owner, who had squandered yesterday's jackpot, was sitting in the same place and polishing some kind of vase, and saw how someone's shadow covered his goods and himself. When he raised his head and saw that it was yesterday's boy who had taken the green cup away from him, the man was very surprised by this. Thinking that this time he would not lower the price, but would say higher, he offered the buyer a new product. James realized that this time he wouldn't get what he needed from him so easily, so he asked the system if he could find antiques from him again. Having decided to mock the merchant a little, he warmly thanked him for yesterday's purchase, and he, in turn, was stunned. Looking at the displayed goods, he began to check each one for authenticity using his ability. Suddenly, the main character moved his gaze to one figurine, the approximate cost of which was about 12.5 million. James said he had his eye on the figurine and wanted to buy it, and added that he wouldn't mind buying it for a few thousand. The happiness on the owner's face was visible from afar with the naked eye, so they quickly agreed. Already after payment, when the guy went home, he began to have great doubts about the price, whether he had given a small one. Opposite him, a large pink and new Jeep stopped, from which a nice girl came out and asked if he had sold the figurine they had talked about yesterday, and said that she would raise the price. Then the owner began to remember again and was already reproaching himself again for selling it to the guy for a few thousand when they were offering millions for it. The cutie continued that her grandfather would be very upset if he found out that his favorite figurine had disappeared somewhere and would increase its price even more just to get it back. When she didn't see what she was looking for on his counter, she was ready to cry right there. The owner tried to calm her down, but it turned out very badly because the figurine left with the boy. Then the girl wiped away her tears and with firm determination asked if he knew in which direction he had gone. Meanwhile, James sat with his antique dealer grandfather and waited for him to name the price while he examined the figurine. Examining it through a magnifying glass, he said that he had the same one at home and it was very dear to him. But then the old man wondered if it was she who was standing in front of him and if her granddaughter had sold her. The main character said that perhaps she is just very similar and another one like her will keep your beloved company. Out of curiosity, he decided to check whether this figurine could belong to this antique dealer, to which the system answered 100%, which really bothered him. The old man, suspecting nothing, said that he wouldn't mind buying it for 9 million and that this figurine could really keep her company. James said it's wonderful when there's more of something you love, and he agreed to the deal. Having received the money, he began to say goodbye to the antique dealer, who gave him his business card and said that if he found something interesting, he could call him. Leaving the building and looking at the card he received, the young man saw a pretty girl rushing towards him. Out of curiosity, he decided to check the chance of her falling. It was 100% and warned her of the possible danger. She didn't listen to him, so she began to fall, waving her arms with her eyes wet from tears. Seeing her fall, James involuntarily stretched out his hands in front of him to soften it a little. As expected, she fell straight into his arms, and at the same time he was not particularly happy about it, saying to himself that she was stupid. Seeing this scene, the people around them said that today's youth have completely lost their shame if they do such a thing. Having clung to the guy with her arms and legs, the girl was not embarrassed by anything, but the victim of her was beginning to be unnerved by all this. She got off him and jumped to meet her, and James in turn said that she would rather listen to him. The main character did not listen to what the girl told him, but instead checked to see if it was the granddaughter of that antique dealer, and as expected, they were 100% white again. The cutie grabbed the phone from his hands and added herself to his contacts, which the guy was surprised by. Looking at her contact on the phone, her beast Mary James did not notice how she left, and remembering the deal, went home across the entire market. Walking along a shopping street, he met an old friend of his, who asked how much he sold that figurine for. The young man casually said that he sold it for 9 million, and said that it was a rather rare and ancient figurine. Meanwhile, the girl reached her grandfather's shop and, peeking around the corner, looked to see if he had his own figurine. But the old man noticed her and asked her to stay, saying that he bought his for 3,000 and bought exactly the same one today for 9 million. Mary involuntarily tensed and said in surprise that this must be a coincidence and his figure was at home now. But sensing something was wrong, grandfather decided not to leave the matter and said that his favorite thing was not there now. The girl said that she had something to do and she had to go. The antique dealer almost shouted at her, scolding her for selling an expensive figurine to him, thereby frightening the cutie even more. But she quickly dialed her grandmother and said with tears that her grandfather was swearing at her, but that a woman's voice from the other end began to scold the old man. Hearing her relative's words, Mary immediately flew out of the shop and promised herself never to touch her grandfather's things again. At the same time, James was walking down the street and felt that something was wrong with that merchant, and because of this he became afraid. He began to look around, thinking that he was being watched and that something would happen, but nothing happened. Walking down the street, the young man thought that that merchant would not leave him so easily and would definitely take revenge, as evidenced by his ability giving 100%. But he said to himself that even if this was the case, he had nothing to fear with his ability, and he could make money on anything. The main character decided that first he needed a car, and a solid one at that, so that he would not be ashamed to appear. Approaching the bus stop, he saw a suspicious guy sneaking up behind a new acquaintance. Having asked the system if this was a thief, to which it answered 100%, he quickly wrote to her to be careful. The girl was very surprised by his appearance and warning, leaving everything to fate. Both saw that the bus had already arrived. James, out of the corner of his eye, saw that guy's hands reaching out to Mary and began to worry about her. He wanted to shout to her to be careful and immediately walked through the crowd towards her. Suddenly, unexpectedly for him and for the thief, the girl hit the second one in the solar plexus with all the strength she had. When the girl turned to face him, he saw that there was anger and determination to wipe him off the face of the earth. Grabbing his hand, the cutie began to lift him, listening to his painful sounds. Throwing him over her back, she threw him to the ground with all her strength, which seemed as if something had snapped. The thief hit the ground with a painful cry, causing them to receive even more attention. The crowd waiting for their turn to board the bus and the people already there started talking. Some even recognized the cutie as the girl from the airport. When Mary finished dealing with him, she said that he was a pervert and wanted to touch her, glad that it was not him who was beaten. But the girl amazed him with her stupidity, and it was good that everything turned out that way. But he was frightened by the force with which the cutie defeated the thief. The young man thought that it was better not to mess with her, for the sake of his own safety. He noticed that Mary was looking at him strangely, and as if she was about to chase him. And out of interest, he decided to check whether the bus would reach its destination. The system returned 0%, and then James began to go through all possible outcomes of events. As it turned out, it will be an arsonist who will blow up the bus and many people will die, including himself. The guy dialed the police number and said that there was a possible terrorist on the bus and there could be many victims. They marked the call as an emergency and asked if there was evidence, which he did not have. Entering the bus, the main character noticed that Mary was also following him, talking on the phone with someone. Seeing her, he remembered how she dealt with the thief, and he felt a little uncomfortable being in the same transport with her. Then the police called on his phone, saying that an employee who was on vacation was now on the same bus and could help. This news made James happy, but he was very annoyed that there was a tail following him in the form of a stupid girl, in his opinion. Having asked whether the criminal was sitting or not, the system gave 100%. Looking out among those sitting, he noticed that Mary was not going to leave him. Then he saw a suspicious man sitting by the window and clutching a black backpack. The young man was delighted to see him, but the main character realized that, seeing his expression, he immediately suspected something was wrong and turned to the window. James reproached himself for such a gross offense and was afraid that the officer might not find this man. He felt someone's hand lay on his shoulder and squeeze it tightly, thereby frightening him. This was his worst guess, but it really was Mary who was not far behind him. With her trick, she scared the guy to death, which is why she reprimanded him that he shouldn't shy away from everyone so much. The cutie continued that if he did something out of the ordinary, he would feel bad. The girl immediately pushed James away and rushed to the man with a backpack at the window, who clearly did not expect such a turn of events. She snatched what turned out to be an open bag from his hands, where there were several bottles of liquid that looked like sunflower oil. The man had an extremely displeased face that he was seen through and caught so quickly. James, having caught the backpack, fell with it to the floor of the bus, and the person sitting earlier got up and wanted to pounce on him. But he didn't have time to do anything because a log of wood hit him in the stomach, causing him to double over. Then he followed with a kick in the back to put the culprit down and prevent him from running away anywhere. It turned out to be Mary. She beat him so much that now it is not a fact that he will run away somewhere while already on the floor and under her foot. The girl said that the man lying on the floor was under arrest and handcuffed him, after which she took the backpack from a stunned James. The cutie opened the backpack and took out all the contents. After sniffing the bottle, she concluded that it was indeed gasoline. Still stunned, James sat on the floor and looked at Mary, thinking that it was better to leave now than to have problems with her later. When the criminal was handed over to the police, everyone who was on the bus got off, and the girl began to wonder how the boy next to her found out about this. About to leave, James shuddered when the girl's hand fell on his shoulder again, telling him not to go far. The main character realized that he was now a suspect and began to worry even more than before and try to leave before things got worse. Before he could take even a couple of steps, his path was blocked by a girl's hand, which hit the wall with force. Even more amazed at her strength, James realized that he had clearly gotten himself into something that he shouldn't have gotten himself into, and with whom he shouldn't have gotten involved. Mary asked how he knew about the criminal, to which she received the answer that he, as a law-abiding citizen, should have notified the police about this and removed his hand from the road. But the girl didn't want to just let him go, so she quickly grabbed his hand, turned his back to her, and pressed his face to the wall. Seeing an incomprehensible noise, Cheryl, going about her business, decided to check what was happening there. Coming closer, she saw some girl pressing James against the wall and trying to find out something from him. Without letting the guy go, Mary invited him to ride with her, drink tea and tell everything, whether he knew the criminal and so on. But the main character had already begun to imagine various outcomes of this tea party and concluded that the cutie might turn out to be too insidious. Seeing this scene, Cheryl looked at them in surprise, covering her mouth with her hand, and did not understand at all what was happening here. The couple, who were sorting things out, also noticed her and involuntarily tensed as the girl who was watching nevertheless asked what was finally going on here. James had already begun to become disillusioned with this life, but at the same time, he came up with a plan to get away from the policeman. He rushed to apologize to the beauty and said that this girl was persistently pestering him and wanted to meet him, and he already had a girlfriend. Everyone around was in complete shock. No one really understood anything. And in addition, the young man pulled this trick, which made everyone speechless. The guy continued to insist on his own and apologize, saying that he was not to blame for anything, thereby putting Cheryl into an even greater stupor. The first to leave was Mary, who stated that she was not pursuing anything like that at all, but only wanted to take him to the station. To which the main character replied that no one said anything about the plot, but it was about tea, but he already had a girlfriend, so he resisted. Not finding anything to say, the cutie began to blush and deny everything, and began to say that he had completely turned everything upside down. She was already quite fed up with this, so saying that they would meet again soon, she heartily hit him in the solar plexus. James was bent in half, and the attacker just said goodbye and walked away, leaving a surprised Cheryl and him. The guy thanked the girl for her understanding and help, to which she replied that now they were even, but Gladys was watching them from afar. She began to think that if he didn't leave Cheryl alone, then she would have to really annoy him somehow. After all, having bought a car, the main character rushed through the city streets and thought that in addition to money, he should also have connections. With connections, if something happens, it will be possible to sell and find antiques at even higher prices, and therefore the profit will be greater. Having reached the already familiar market, James got out of the car and headed to his old friend. Seeing his neighbor, the guy asked where he was, to which he replied that Alex had gone to buy new goods and would not return soon. A little disappointed after having a few more exchanges with the merchant, he asked if he could find antiques today. He was very surprised that for the first time in all the time he received such a strict 0%. This excited the young man very much. Wandering around the market, he finally decided to try, despite the 0%, and approached one of the merchants, starting to look at the goods laid out by him. James was very attracted to a small and seemingly old brown vase, and he bargained with the owner for several thousand. Before that, he checked all his chances that he would be able to buy it profitably and sell it later, but all the numbers suddenly began to disappear. Then the familiar voice of Gladys was heard, who appeared out of nowhere and said that she would pay even more for this vase. The merchant, immediately happy, wanted to give it to the girl in order to make a profit as quickly as possible. But then the voice of the main character was heard. He doubled the price offered by the beauty, if only he would give the ancient thing to him, fearing that he might lose a good deal. But Gladys did not want to stop and continued to increase the price, hoping that James would finally give up. The guy realized that it was better not to play with her like that, so he abandoned his idea and said that it was useless for her to fight with him like that, whether she wanted it or not, but he would always have income. The girl didn't want to just let it go, so she threatened that it was better to refuse to resell it before she destroyed it. Dissatisfied with this conversation and with a little fear, James walked away from her, thinking that she would not take him easily. But the system decided differently, showing him 100% white before his eyes, for which the guy simply wanted to throw it out. Satisfied with her purchase, she decided to continue to put a spoke in his wheels, following him and buying things that he finds several times over. Following on his heels, the girl annoyed the young man every time, raising the price several times higher than he offered. Approaching the next merchant, James could no longer withstand her onslaught and shouted for her to leave him alone in the end. To which Gladys replied that she had nothing to do with it. She simply buys antiques at a higher price since he does not have enough money. And if he doesn't give up his idea of cashing in on old things and Cheryl, then she promises that no problems will arise. The girl continued that one way or another, he had no chance against her, to which the guy agreed that he really didn't have any, but there was no point in rushing to conclusions. Gladys said that she had made inquiries about him and knew everything about him, and remembered that he spoke about some kind of force with the help of which he learned about her. The girl concluded that you shouldn't count on her. The beauty would crush him faster than he could come to his senses. This whole monologue not only frightened James, but also made him frantically go through options on how he could get away from her. After she said that force would not help him against her, the fear went to zero, but doubts on the contrary came. Therefore, with complete confidence, the guy replied that it was better to underestimate him, because he was going to teach her a lesson. After their conversation, James and his pursuer again went to look for goods from a new merchant. He talked with him without buying anything, then went to the next one and also talked with him without buying anything. So the guy talked to all the traders who were at the market, and Gladys, in turn, did not understand why he was doing this. In the end, James finally came up to her and said that everything was fine now and we could continue, Then he shouted to the whole street that he wanted to buy up all the goods on the shelves of all the merchants for several million, which shocked the girl. But she was not at a loss and immediately offered several times more than what was offered earlier and said that she was taking everything. Seeing her pressure, James pretended to be worried and said that there was no need to get excited and it was better to think things over first. To which Gladys replied that she didn't care much and it would be better for him to stand aside calmly at last. The merchants hesitated, thinking that this might be a trick, but the girl immediately suggested that they also make money on delivery. They happily accepted the checks she gave them, said what a good day it was, and the girl was pleased with herself. But James, unexpectedly for her, approached the merchants and asked if everything was in force, to which the answer was that of course, and 50% would soon transfer it. The joyful crowd only had time to thank the main character, but no one noticed Gladys, who had darkened like a cloud. She realized what the catch was and could not forgive herself for defeat, so she left the words that they would get even and went home. The guy replied that just let her try and she would lose to him again, and that now he would put a spoke in the wheels if something happened. Having said goodbye on such a note, the girl left, and the main character went to wander around the market in search of food. Then he saw a system update sign in front of him, which made him very scared and almost choked. Leaving the market, James thought about her and concluded that in the future he would only be able to understand what had changed. But for now, he returned to thoughts about expanding his connections. He noticed that a man was waiting at his car. As he approached, the man said that he had been sent for him and was invited to a social event. The main character did not immediately believe him and expressed this, to which the stranger replied that this was an order from Mrs. Gladys and he had nothing bad in himself. When he finally agreed, after putting himself in order, they arrived at a luxurious huge house with large windows and open doors. Gladys stood in them and called him into the house, saying that if he wanted to be so rich thanks to antiques, then he better be here. They entered a huge hall with a large crystal chandelier and a large number of guests, among whom waiters walked. The girl introduced him to her influential friends, which is why at first the young man was afraid. But then he introduced him to the toilet and began to talk more easily. After talking, they went to the table where they sat down, and the girl said that she was surprised at how he showed himself today. She also explained that they were currently at a charity auction, and she wanted him to sell one thing. In conclusion, she said that she would give the opportunity to sell a rare vase on her behalf because she was kind today, and she hoped that he understood the responsibility. Joyful James said that of course he understands everything and is grateful for such a show of kindness and will not forget her. The auctioneer began to call everyone present to the auction. The guy rose from his seat and headed towards him. The man announced that Mr. James would go first with his vase, the starting price of which was 12.5 million. Holding the box with the artifact in his hands, the main character was very worried and did not want to fall face down in front of all these people. The young man put it on the podium and, opening the lid, discovered that it was not a vase at all, but ordinary toilet paper. He was in complete shock, horror and misunderstanding how this could happen and how to get out of it now. James stood there like a statue, not knowing what to do in this situation and where to put himself so as not to feel like a fool. Then he remembered that Gladys asked him to pick up the earring under the table, which she herself had accidentally dropped, and realized that this number was her doing. He was pulled out of all these memories by the voice of the auctioneer, who decided to joke that he was in a hurry to go to the toilet rather than sell the vase. Realizing that he now looks very stupid, the main character began to quickly figure out what he should do, and one thought came to him. Pulling himself together, he began to compose as he went and said that this role was of great value to him. James said that he used to be a terrible crybaby and could cry with or without reason, with or without his parents. Then they began to think about what to do with him and came to an interesting conclusion that could amuse the crybaby. One day during breakfast, his father gave him a roll of toilet paper. The boy did not understand why and asked it. The father further said that since he often cries, he will need napkins to wipe away these very tears. In conclusion, James wanted to note that only after receiving this gift did he stop crying, even with a bunch of debts behind him. Therefore, he decided that even if this thing seems just a stupid joke, it is not so, and it is different for everyone. Placing the roll of paper on the podium, he finished by saying that only thanks to it, he had become a real man and would like to sell it. After all that was said, the main character realized that even without all this tirade, people realized that he was more like a clown here. When there was silence, a man with an expensive cigar in his hands said that he wanted to buy a roll for 10 million. James's whole face shone with joy and happiness that his clowning was not in vain. After the deal, Gladys said that this time he was also lucky, and it wouldn't be like that forever. Having abandoned this, she left the hall, and the main character wondered when everything would be calm. Reflecting on the past, he went down to the parking lot and thought about how to increase his income and connections. Lost in his thoughts, the young man noticed a red car out of the corner of his eye. Cheryl was there and the man who bought toilet paper from him. James thought this was very strange, and only now did he understand what kind of relationship there could be between her and Gladys. Looking after them, he hoped that he would never have such adventures again. The guy wondered if Cheryl could be somehow connected with him, to which he received an answer from the system that they were getting married for the sake of a joint business. Having reached his car, James decided that it would be better to find a fellow antique dealer now. He involuntarily remembered his friend, with whose help he became rich. Inspired by this idea, he started the car and rushed to his home market. When the main character drove up to him, the owner was talking to someone on the phone about a deal. Arriving at Alex, the young man said hello and immediately moved on to the matter that was tormenting his mind. Having offered cooperation to the merchant, James received a refusal and the answer that he was the only one working. A little upset, he wandered back home, and two people approached his friend. The young man was interested in this couple, and he listened to their conversation. They were talking about an ancient blade. The owner welcomed them cordially and said that he had everything ready and agreed to buy the goods. The couple unwrapped the package and showed their goods and its complete authenticity. James suddenly wondered whether it was fake or real, to which the system replied that it was real, but there was a fake. Then she brought out a sign with a picture in front of his eyes, where she showed a fake stone on the handle. Immediately, the main character warned Alex about the supposed danger, to which he replied that he didn't want to see him anymore and let him go on his way and not interfere with his business. The merchant, almost shouting, drove him away, remembering those 2 times, and also said that he should not dream of cooperation. James immediately decided to slow down, saying that if he found where the fake was, he would agree. Taking the sword from his hands, the merchant nevertheless agreed to his terms, but if not, then he would pay him its entire value. Without wasting any time, the guy took a small hammer and swung it at the handle. When he reached his goal, a small pebble broke off and fell to the ground. Alex was ready to tear the insolent man to pieces on the spot, but his anger was misunderstood. After seeing his work, James was pleased with the perfect work and with himself. He held out the scabbard and asked if there were QR codes in those days, to which he immediately replied that he doubted it. In the small hole where the pebble used to be, there was indeed a black square with various others inside. The owner, surprised, snatched the sword from the young man's hands and tried to check what was happening. James said that he himself was cheated worse than he was those 2 times. Alex was ready to tear and throw from anger, irritation, and so on. Seeing this, the couple quickly ran away. The main character said that you shouldn't be so upset and think about his proposal again. The merchant said that he was still against it, but he was ready to give some things for free as a thank you. Having rummaged through his junk, he pulled out a red cloth, which he praised to the skies, but the young man said that he was not interested in it. Then, having sorted through all his goods, the owner took out new scabbards and began to praise them. He said it was an ancient scabbard and one could make a fortune with it. The system immediately showed that these were genuine antiques, and they were quite expensive. James was shocked by the information he received, and he couldn't believe that a merchant could have something so expensive. But the owner did not want to part with them so easily, because he himself was going to resell the blade more profitably. James said he wanted it as a thank you. Alex responded more aggressively and still continued to stand his ground. The main character began to put pressure on him that if he did not give it back, problems might arise and he would not have new clients. The merchant's face became more and more white with every word. He did not want to part with it just like that. His heart was bleeding, thinking that now he could lose everything if he did not give it away and lose all the profit. With sadness and pain, he still gave James the blade and told him to leave and wish him a good day. Having thanked Alex, James wished him the same and headed to another friend of his. He was already approaching a familiar building, which brought back pleasant recent memories. The main character hoped that this time he would be able to make a profitable deal with that antique dealer. Entering the room, he saw a girl who was putting ancient artifacts in order. Noticing him, she said that she would call Mr. Michael. While waiting for him, the young man suddenly heard a familiar voice and someone grunting. It turned out to be Mary for some unknown reason, warming up right around the fragile exhibits. She looked at him sternly. James decided to check whether he should defend himself now, to which the system responded with 100%. Then the girl suddenly raised her hand, preparing to attack, with a rather terrifying look. The main character, before he had finished reading the sign, immediately saw it and was surprised at its speed. It's good that he managed to dodge, otherwise he would have walked around with a black eye. James dodged in time and Mary missed, but instead grabbed an antique vase and prepared to launch it. Then her grandfather's voice came from behind her and she was surprised and terribly frightened by his sudden appearance. The antiquarian was furious and yelled at his granddaughter, who almost dropped the ancient artifact. The main character exhaled and thought that it was good that everything turned out so well for him and Mr. Michael arrived in time for him. Mary, in turn, simply couldn't leave him with her grandfather, thinking that he was going to deceive him again, and decided to eavesdrop on their conversation. Entering a spacious room with a standing wooden table and stumps instead of stools, Mr. Michael and James began to discuss the sudden appearance of the second. The main character said that he wanted the master to check the authenticity of the antiquity of the sword, and asked what its value was good for sale. The antiquarian was very surprised by the young man's find and began to carefully examine it, after which he concluded that he was very lucky with ancient relics. Further, Mr. Michael said that the cost of this blade starts at 60 million and took out a checkbook. He wrote out exactly the amount he had named, thereby greatly surprising and delighting James, adding that he had good knowledge of antiques. The main character admitted that he was just very attentive, and to prove this, the guy said that his granddaughter, who had climbed the wall, was now listening to them. Mr. Michael didn't believe it at first, but decided to check, and the guy's words turned out to be true. He saw a girl hanging on the ledge, who was not embarrassed by anything. Noticing that her grandfather and James had discovered her, she immediately jumped down and promised, running away, that she would never do that again. Returning to the conversation, the antiquarian decided to test the young man's knowledge and offered to tell him about the ancient treasures in this room. Thanks to the system, the main character already knew everything about all the artifacts and, without doubting anything, told him about each one with some details. Mr. Michael was completely shocked by his knowledge and how easily he told it all. Having praised the young man for such precise answers, he offered to drink some more tea and talk about another relic. Having shown it, James immediately, without a doubt, told him everything about it. This struck the old man into even greater shock and admiration, and said that he would need a little help. The main character doubted his truthfulness and sincerity, to which the system said that there was no catch and you could trust him, even though he could be used for his own purposes. They left the room and headed towards the basement. On the way, Mr. Michael said that he wanted him to check the authenticity of one very expensive and rare vase. The antiquarian and the young man approached the huge, massive iron door of the safe, which hid some jewelry behind it. Opening it and going inside, the main character saw rows of many small safes, in which something very expensive and rare was stored. They reached another similar door, and the antique dealer warned that if James could tell whether it was original or not, he would help him out a lot. Entering the room, the guy saw in front of him a huge white vase with drawings of blue dragons on its sides. Here the system came to the rescue and showed that the fake was in the bottom of this jewelry, and there was a risk of damaging it. The young man explained that the bottom is fake, and in order to check this, you need to break the vase. The antique dealer was against this and said that he would not do this without the real owner because its price exceeded $1 billion. After Mr. Michael's call, a tall, plump man arrived who looked very worried and asked what was the matter. The antiquarian and James explained to him in a few words what was happening, after which the young man reached for one of the artifacts in order to use it to destroy the other. Having raised his hand, the owner stopped him, saying that if he did anything with this vase, he would not only have big problems, but he could also go to jail. Understanding all this, James thought that even if this all happened, he would have nothing to lose. Having fully realized his position, he nevertheless threw a thing that looked like a hammer, thereby breaking the ancient vase. Mr. Michael said in a stern voice that if it really turns out to be a fake, then it will not be the young man who will have problems, but him. Meanwhile, the system tried to tell where exactly the fake was located and in which part it should be looked for. With her help, James began to carefully break the remains from the bottom of the expensive vase, being afraid to damage the evidence. When he broke the next piece, the owner's face was whiter than a sheet, and the main character no longer had the same confidence as before. The guy was ready to despair and thought that by his actions, he had already multiplied and destroyed everything that could be. Suddenly, in the last piece, he discovered something very interesting. It was a plate with a QR code and handed it to those watching. The owner of the fake vase was practically shaking, and Mr. Michael was furious and ready to destroy it on the spot. One way or another, satisfied with his work and profit, James went home and continued to wander around the market. He got into the car and rushed to the other end of the market, where his good old friend usually traded. As he drove up, the main character noticed that some people wearing bandages covering their faces had parked near his counter and were walking towards him. They first grabbed Alex with force and dragged him to the car, and then began to push him into it with his feet, and the merchant clearly resisted. When the unknown people finally dragged him into the car, quickly closing the door, they drove away headlong, and James rushed after them to sleep with his friend. Having fallen behind at some distance, he came to an abandoned building with glass falling out of the windows and began to think about what to do. The system showed the location of the owner and indicated several paths to reach him. The merchant lay bound hand and foot, gagged and face swollen from beatings. Seeing his deplorable state, James climbed through the window to free him and escape with him, and the man was surprised by his unexpected appearance. Having freed him, the main character said that they had better hurry up while no one is there, to which Alex replied that he was not important and that he would save himself. The young man did not want to leave him and was very surprised by the answer, after which he replied that he could help him if they left now. The merchant kept refusing and was stalling for some reason, but this was already getting on James's nerves. Then a plan came to his mind. He said that he would pay him 10 million for the sword that he bought from him. And this plan worked. The owner immediately jumped to his feet and was ready to escape. This gave him a lot of motivation, and said that the sooner they leave here, the better for them. Then they heard someone's voices outside the door and got very scared, after which they began to quickly figure out what to do in this situation. James said that this was what they were missing, and began looking around the room for possible hiding spots. When the voices were already in the room, they died down, and then there was a cry that the prisoner had escaped, and they rushed to search for him. Meanwhile, the couple hid behind the nearest boxes, and their hearts were ready to jump out of their chests in surprise. At the same moment, people were rushing all over the area with something heavy and looking for fugitives. When the footsteps and voices died down, they leaned out from behind a pile of bricks and continued their rescue from the mysterious base. Running along it, they turned right, and Alex said that he knew his way around here well, and asked if he had ever been here. James said that he trusted his intuition and roughly remembered the route of his entry here. At the same time, they were unsuspectingly watched by a man smoking an expensive cigar. He said that he needed them alive at any cost, and he was furious that he had been so exposed for counterfeiting antiques. His subordinate said that people had already gone in search, but before he could finish speaking, his boss suddenly kicked him in the stomach. He doubled over, and his boss said that if they didn't catch these two, then the authorities would become interested in their activities, and then all was lost. Meanwhile, the fugitives had covered half the distance and were hiding from the next patrol around the corner. The system immediately gave 2 escape routes: through the wall, which had a high chance, and through the gate, which had a lower chance. They decided to try their luck and, too tired, headed towards the gate, hiding from the patrols they came across along the way. The couple reached the desired place, and the owner immediately perked up and headed to the gate ahead of James. Approaching, the system gave out with each step an increasing percentage of the success of the escape, when suddenly the doors slammed shut, and from behind they heard a car arriving. Turning around, their eyes were blinded by the turned-on car headlights, and joyful voices were heard that they had finally been caught. Joyful people began to get out of the car, ready to attack at any moment, and their boss was sitting in the front seat. Pushing Alex away, James swung, ready to attack and fight back at any moment. The bandits attacked him en masse, thereby not giving him a chance to escape and win this battle. Having dealt with 2, the main character could barely stand on his feet and was not going to just give up. But then the boss came out and hit the main character so hard in the face that blood sprayed from his nose. The leader of the bandits did not want to stop at the boy and kicked the merchant in the stomach so that he would not help the already injured. But Alex did not stop and decided to discourage him, and threw himself on his leg and said that his wife was ready to pay them for his ransom. Only they had to name the price. The boss didn't even listen to him and roughly kicked him, thereby throwing him off and knocking him out. He praised him for such an attempt, but there was no need to be so heroic, and said that it would be better not to try to escape and not to call an assistant. They still had no chance. Having fallen face down into the ground, James no longer knew what to do to get them both out, when suddenly an idea came to his mind. The guy said that he works with them, and they had a plan to amaze him even more by selling him more and more fakes, and it worked. Alex immediately perked up and was furious that everyone was using him so brazenly, and the system showed that this would help them escape with 100% probability. He first dealt with the remaining 2 subordinates and the boss, and promised that he would not leave a wet spot behind the main character, and headed towards him. The merchant hit him in the solar plexus. The young man was saved by the fact that he managed to place a metal plate under his shirt in time, which softened the blow. The angry man ran into the gate, thereby knocking it out and falling exhausted to the ground, hitting James. Having somehow dragged him to the car, the main character saw that he was unconscious and complained that he was so heavy. The beaten leader of the bandits lit a cigarette and said that he would not leave them so easily and would have to act decisively. The victims arrived at the hospital. After a while, Alex came to his senses and began to repent for his inattention and gullibility. He was so upset that he even burst into tears, and James began to console him that he did not hold a grudge against him and that he was not to blame and would give him the promised money. Then the man jumped up and said that now they could get into very big trouble and they could start being followed in order to take revenge. The main character checked out of interest and could not believe his eyes. The system gave 100% for every guess made by the owner. He was pulled out of his surprised state by a phone call. It was Mr. Michael calling and saying that he would be out of town for a while, and he urged them to be careful. He found some information about the kidnappers, but it is very little and should not be trusted, so it is better that they do nothing and hide somewhere. James exhaled and said that it was better to do so, and the victim replied that he would be happy to follow this instruction. But when the guy remembered the signs with 100% that appeared, he was ready to tear his hair out from the fact that he found himself in such a risky situation. Meanwhile, the bandit leader called one of his acquaintances and explained the situation and said that he needed help to get rid of him. The voice on the phone said that it would help, but its services are not free, and it's time to start playing an interesting game. At the same moment, the couple got into the car and began to discuss a plan of action. Alex did not want to just leave the matter, so much so that he pulled off the mask that covered his face with anger. He squeezed it and directly began to threaten that he would wipe them off the face of the earth for such meanness that they decided to sell him counterfeit goods. James said that they would definitely figure it out, but first they needed to find someone who could tell them about this gang. The merchant replied that he had one person, but he was in a ghost market. Pressing the gas pedal to the floor, they headed towards their destination, full of hope that all this would soon be over. Arriving at the ghostly market, the couple began to wonder about it, and Alex said that here they could find their informant who could get them everything and tell them. The friends did not notice that they were being followed by the person they were looking for. He said to himself that money was still more valuable to him than he was, and went off to spread rumors. An unknown man behind him was watching him. It was with him that he had a deal that he would spread gossip to slander an acquaintance. The couple went to the merchant's friend, and where he called him, he said that he was not going to sell him anything, and that he should go try his luck somewhere else. From such an answer, Alex's nostrils widened greatly, and it seemed that smoke was pouring out of anger and indignation. Then he asked what exactly was the matter. His acquaintance replied that everyone around him already knew that he had joined Mr. Michael, so no one wanted to deal with him now. The man decided to check it out and turned around. He saw that behind his back, there was already a lot of whispering on this topic, although in fact, this was far from the case. Alex wanted to start making excuses that it was all a bullshit lie and that they wouldn't believe it, and James, meanwhile, wondered what the catch was. Then he grabbed him by the hand and dragged him into some alley, amid shouts that the two of them should get out of this place and not come here again. Having turned into an alley, the merchant still did not understand what was happening here and why everyone suddenly began to hate him. Then the main character explained that they had been set up and someone did not want them to cooperate with them. Walking down this alley, he continued, saying that first they would need a disguise so that they would not be driven away again. Taking out jackets with a hood and a mask for both, they again went in search of their informant. Approaching various editions, the couple pretended to examine the goods that interested them, and the unsuspecting merchant offered them more and more new ones. Then they heard the details of the gossip from the people they approached, and it turned out that our merchant left everything and joined not only Mr. Michael, but also his society. From this, Alex almost burst with anger and such blatant slander, and he was ready to tear out their tongues by the roots for spreading such information. But James stopped him, saying that now was not the best time to start a fight and sort things out, and took him aside. He began to think about what to do and what to do next, when suddenly his companion left him and headed towards the object of interest. The merchant came up to examine one old box, which he could not immediately open. His colleague said that it was worth several thousand, to which he replied that he knew the value of this relic and did not need to explain further what it was. James approached him and asked why he needed it. He received the answer that this box could be bought here for pennies and then resold at a higher price. Before the owner had time to tell this, someone's heavy, large hand fell on his find, thereby ending the joyful moment. It was a tall and strange man who said that this box was worth much more than the measly couple of thousand for which it was offered. James realized that something was wrong here, and he needed to get out of here as soon as possible so as not to get into any trouble again. The unknown man added that its cost starts from 300,000 and it is quite valuable, thereby plunging everyone around into shock. He continued, saying that this place was clearly not suitable for her, and if they retreated, there would be no problems. The merchant was not pleased with his appearance, thereby showing his dissatisfaction by saying that he was taking on a lot. The unknown person began to lose his temper and said that if he was so opposed, he could check the authenticity himself or get acquainted with his fighting technique. James noticed that a crowd of onlookers began to gather around, wanting to see what kind of showdown had started. Without waiting for an unknown answer, the guy apologized for his friend and said that they understood the value and would not bother him anymore. As he was getting ready to leave, the man blocked the couple's way, saying that they were well versed in antiques, thereby surprising them. He offered a deal. If they could then solve the mystery of the box, then they could get what they were looking for. James decided to check whether the box was really so valuable and whether there was something in it, for which the system gave 150% to the questions. The unknown person immediately began to quickly rearrange the small parts of the box from which it was made from place to place. There were quite a lot of them, and it took some time to unlock the mechanism, and a new wooden box appeared from there. The main character no longer liked what he had gotten himself into, and the merchant behind him began to panic that they had gotten caught like that. The guy became darker than a cloud and checked the system to see if the man was somehow connected with who they were looking for, to which the answer was only 50%. He decided to quickly leave this place, thanking the master for his science and once again apologized to him for the inconvenience they had caused. But the crowd did not want the show to end and demanded that it continue, thereby loudly repeating the gossip that spread like wildfire. This really annoyed Alex, and he was about to shout at everyone that this was stupid slander against an honest man, but then James pulled him away. He said that he was overly hot-tempered, and it was better not to attract attention to himself again. As a friend, they heard a new male voice. It was a large man with a not very pleasant face, who said that if they could figure it out, they could take her away just like that. The main character realized, thanks to the system, that with him the search could speed up, and his help would not be superfluous, and not paying attention to the surprised look of his friend, he agreed. Still using his ability, he said that the inside of this wooden box was empty, but it had a secret mechanism that could be used to open access to the treasure. The first unknown person opened a small box and was surprised that the guy guessed right, even without ever looking inside. But this news even calmed him down, and he exhaled, saying that there really was another mechanism in it, but no one knew how to find and open it. Then James took the box from his hands and began to examine it, turning it in his hands and waiting for the system to start helping. He discovered a small protrusion at the bottom and pulled it out, still surprising those around him. On the wooden plate, there was a drawing in the form of a flower with many petals, but the young man knew that this was a secret riddle with which he could open the treasure. Still, with the help of the system, James easily passed the secret and invisible labyrinth that she showed him. Watching him, the first unknown man began to get a little nervous and worry about how he knew about all this if he was seeing it for the first time in his life. After going through the entire labyrinth, the main character unlocked a compartment in which a green jade bracelet appeared, which was broken into 3 parts. The crowd and others surrounding and watching him were stunned by such an event, and everyone did not understand how he pulled it off. The second unknown man said that it was not bad, but his grandson made a little mistake. He, in turn, admitted defeat to him and apologized for his inattention. He approached his friends and admitted that he admired their talents and had never seen such people, and James smiled contentedly at him. The man offered them a competition. If they could evaluate the antiques and offer a large sum for it, they would win. He even specifically showed a couple of banknotes as confirmation that he was not lying and everything would be fair. The friends fell out of reality a little, but immediately returned and looked at the money in shock, as if they had seen it for the first time in their lives. But they were brought out of this state by the voice of a man who said that if they lose, they will no longer have to appear on the antique market in principle. James wasn't even nervous, but was completely confident that his system would not fail and would give him everything on a plate without errors. A tense silence hung around. A crowd of onlookers traders waited for the banquet to continue, and their companions looked at each other, hoping to understand what they could expect from their opponent. The main character saw, with the help of the system, an ancient vase and began to talk about its value and the story in a couple of sentences. His opponent praised him, but offered 2 rare books, the cost of which could exceed several million. The guy said that it was not too important, to which the man sharply replied that for real connoisseurs, this is a real treasure for which they could give their entire fortune. But on the whole, they ended there, because they no longer found anything worthwhile. After which the elder laughed and said that the young man was no mistake, and invited him to his place. They left, and their friends were left in a little confusion about what had just happened. James decided to check whether the family of these strangers was somehow connected with that gang, and whether they could count on their help against them. And the system answered every question with 100%. He also expressed doubts about them to his friend, to which he reacted with surprise and a little worry on his face. Alex said that even if so, then let them trust fate for now and not think too much of anything, but now they just need to rest. The next day, they arrived at that stranger's home and were amazed at the size of the mansion they saw. It was really huge. Until they crossed the threshold of this house, the merchant still could not stop taking photographs of the house and its background. He also noted that it would be a pleasure to cooperate with him, and that he was ready for this, and happily shook his hand. Then their handshake was suddenly touched by the paw of a dog with a dull look, which had appeared from nowhere. James remembered her. She appeared on the day he discovered the ability and committed a pogrom in the lottery store. Looking up, they saw a girl hurrying towards them, who promised that she would immediately return the dog to the leash, and the guy immediately recognized her. But the beauty herself did not immediately recognize him. After a while, she remembered him from meeting her dog in the park. Having put a leash on the dog, the girl agreed to take them to the head of the family, not paying attention to the unexpected silence from behind. They entered the courtyard of a huge mansion, in a friendly company with a dog on a leash at the beginning of their column. The girl suddenly got confused in her own house and asked her pet to find her grandfather, thereby convincing James that she was a little stupid. Then her older brother came up as she turned to him and told him that this couple was looking for their grandfather and she wanted to accompany them. Leaving them, the girl said goodbye to them, and the friends went after a person they already knew. They entered a small terrace where they saw an old man lying on a chaise longue under an umbrella, looking unsuspecting. When his grandson called him, he got up from his resting place and said that he knew what they really needed. He showed his friends the flash drive and explained that it contains all the information about those bandits and kidnappers, and they will be able to take it if they pass the test. The friends agreed, and then they followed him to his office to pass that test, and once there, they saw that it was all teeming with various antiques. J6 was shocked by this and began to worry about what he had to do, even though he had a system for it, but the excitement did not go away. Fanning himself, the old man said that if he could determine whether it was original or fake, they could take the flash drive. Otherwise, they would be thrown out of here. Alex agreed to these conditions and said that James would certainly solve everything correctly, thereby putting him into a kind of stupor of surprise. And to begin with, he paid attention to the head of Buddha, which was preserved quite well for its age. But the main character replied that it was a fake, which was created recently, and therefore was well preserved, thereby surprising the owner of the place. Then the merchant took a thing similar to a candlestick and said that it was also in good condition, but the young man dissuaded him of this, saying that it was another fake. The friend did not dare to stop and continued to babble some nonsense about the antiques that surrounded him, and meanwhile James became gloomier. Suddenly, Alex noticed the calligraphy hanging on the wall and said that it was quite difficult to fake and was probably the original. But even here, the young man said that this was another fake, thereby infuriating the owner of the place. He also added that all antique-looking things are fake and reproached him for treating his collection with such disdain. The man had completely lost his temper and said that such words simply nullified all his work and offered to retract his words. But James did not want to give in and stood his ground, and the situation in the room became increasingly tense. They didn't even pay attention to the almost unconscious Alex, who was already stretched out on the floor and still offered to admit defeat. Having come to his senses, he finally decided to dissuade the gloomy young man and said that everyone makes mistakes, and behind them stood the owner, pleased with himself. The main character turned to face him and did not feel any trick, but the system had previously said that with his help, it would be possible to get rid of problems in the form of kidnappers. Therefore, he said that he did not renounce his words, that there were only fakes all around, thereby heating the situation to the limit, and the poor merchant grabbed his head, not knowing what to do. Then the old man suddenly grabbed him so that this poor fellow screamed in pain and surprise, and James said that he should not be involved here since he was not to blame. The man crouched down and extended his fingers into a seal in front of him, preparing to attack, and began to scream threateningly, taking the guy by surprise. His blow landed on one of the points on his body, thereby bringing him to his knees in pain. When the young man collapsed, his friend tried to somehow cheer him up, saying that he could foresee his actions, but he sat gloomy and bent over. The old man in turn laughed loudly and said that he was good, and the performance went off with a bang, and his friends looked at him with a blank look. Then someone's fingers touched James's back, thereby reducing the pain and helping him get up. It turned out to be Mr. Michael, who replied that he really did a good job, and the guy looked at him in surprise and did not understand where he came from. The owner of the house once again praised the young man for such amazing attentiveness and accuracy to the things that were here. When everyone realized that it was just a test, Alex burst into tears from everything he had experienced and said that he was very worried about his friend. But he was led by the feelings of the owner, who said that he could arrange a similar check for him if he wished. The owner decided to mock the upset merchant a little, and he, in turn, was against such bullying that he grabbed his head. But back to the point, the owner said that this room is actually full of all sorts of fakes, and he explained that this is a special test to see the attentiveness and knowledge of the subject in antiques. The owner also admitted that he calls this room the Room of Lies, because everything here is completely false. James realized that the owner of this mansion was not involved in the antique counterfeiting case, but someone from his family was definitely there, and while thinking about it, he watched the loading sign in front of his eyes. Once again praising the young man, the man said that he and Mr. Michael had a very profitable and pleasant offer for him. Then the second antiquarian spoke up and invited him to become the main participant in their society instead of one who dropped out. The main character's eyes lit up with joy. With such a proposal, he will be able to solve two of his problems, one with finding connections and the second with income. Happy with this proposal, the guy thought about it for some time, and in the meantime, his friend realized what was happening and hastened to explain. He explained that there were more than 1,000 people in this society, all of them ordinary like him, but he never boasted that he was a member of it. Mr. Michael said they take into account all of James' talents and abilities and believe he could become one in his own right. The friends still could not comprehend the complete happiness that had fallen on their heads, so they simply stood in shock with their mouths open. Alex once again repeated the words of the antique dealer and could not believe that his friend was being offered to become an important big shot. And the young man asked who they were. Then he explained that there are a few such people, about 17 people, and that they are the leaders of this society. Then suddenly the merchant began to ask to be promoted to the main one, since his friend was promoted to 1, and he still remains a private. To which he received the answer that he would continue to develop his potential, and then perhaps he would be promoted to the main one. Or if he is so eager to increase his rank, then the owner of the house is ready to test him too, and Alex immediately began to deny. Mr. Michael said that Jordan mainly made decisions about joining, but Jordan immediately saw through him and asked why he was hiding behind him. But the merchant did not let up and said that he and James were already like brothers, and they couldn't throw things away like that. So where he went, the other would immediately follow. After talking about the departure of one of the main ones, who was engaged in counterfeiting antiques, Jordan said that Michael was too soft, to which he received the answer that not everything in the world can be solved with fists. The 4 of them went out onto the terrace that they had seen before and began to drink tea. The owner of the house offered a drink for such an event and opened the vessel with the drink. Looking at him, Alex's mouth began to water because he also wanted a drink and was very jealous of him. James suddenly asked where the fake antiques came from, and then Mr. Michael explained that when their society was just beginning to appear, the market was full of fake goods. The owner of the house said that there was a good time when they fought against counterfeits, but like all good things, they came to an end. Someone appeared on the market who continued to make fakes and distribute them, and others followed him, taking his example and doing the same, filling all the counters of antique dealers with their products. Each time the master of forgeries became better and better, and it was no longer possible to find out whether it was a fake or not without a full examination. Then James remembered how he had broken the fake vase with dragons and was glad that he could save Mr. Michael from such a purchase. And the antiquarian said that even in their society there are such people, for example, a recently retired person who was caught doing this. At the mention of it, the owner of the house almost broke the armrests of his chair out of anger and began to threaten those who were involved in this. He promised that as soon as he found out their names, they would begin to regret that they were born and they would not receive mercy from him. Looking at his angry appearance, James thought about how to find a traitor in his family and that he would not have to cross the road if something happened. The guy immediately asked the system if it could be a certain person, to which he received the answer that there would be no answer to such a question. He realized that it was better to stop asking such questions and decided to ask more clarifying ones, and the ability to answer each question brought up a loading screen, which greatly frightened the young man. Therefore, brushing her off, he returned to the conversation, and at the same time thinking about who it could be. The owner of the house said that by becoming a core member of society, he would automatically be at risk for his life, so the final decision would be his alone. James, after listening to this, thought that he was no longer on the best terms with the bandits, but even so, he did not want this to continue, and besides, he had a system to help. After his thoughts, he abruptly stood up from his seat, thereby surprising Mr. Michael a little. The guy said that he agreed to join the society, help him, and would make every effort to expose the scammers. The senior antiquarians praised him for his attitude and said that they would need to discuss his entry with the other members, to which Alex turned away and said that he thought it had all been settled long ago. Placing his hand on his heart, the young man joyfully exclaimed that he would be careful and resolve this issue, and would definitely receive votes for its adoption. Meanwhile, the gang leader sat and discussed with someone on the phone their plan to capture James and destroy society. He, playing with a knife, promised that Mr. Michael would be first in line and everyone else would immediately follow him. And throwing a knife at his photograph hanging on the wall, he hung up the call and began to think about this plan. Having already drunk enough, Jordan joyfully said that he felt so good that he was ready to sit with them until the morning. And calling his eldest grandson, he suggested adding more minor ones, meaning his grandchildren, who understood his intentions and left. Looking at the person leaving, James thought that perhaps he was somehow connected with them, because he looked somehow suspicious, to which the system also indicated that there was no answer. They sat on the terrace in a good mood, and there were no signs of trouble. The three of them chatted, and Mr. Michael drank tea with pleasure. The antique dealer remembered that he had not informed his granddaughter about the feast, and called her, having received an answer. He said that she would be there at 7, and then the slightly drunk owner of the house answered that it was nothing, and they could wait. James, out of interest, began checking the probability of arriving at 7 and other hours, and the system gave only 0% for each option. Suspecting something bad, he asked if Mary was in danger, to which he received the answer that such a probability would be 78%. Nervous, the guy said that Mary was in mortal danger and perhaps she would not come to the feast. Those sitting at the table all immediately fell silent, and a tense silence hung for some time. Everyone was shocked by this news. Jordan said that this couldn't be happening. They could just be walking and nothing would threaten her, and he was about to leave when his friend slowed him down. Mr. Michael said that he would call her right away and find out how she dialed her number and heard long beeps that lasted for what seemed like an eternity. There was a tense silence and no voice was heard on the other end, thereby raising suspicions of danger. Mr. Michael said she must be on a mission because she turns off her phone when she goes there. James asked the system if it could show where Mary was now, to which he received a loading sign, and the dissatisfied one began to wait. Meanwhile, the owner of the house was furious, knowing that his friend's granddaughter was in danger, and reproached him for sitting so calmly and rubbing his nose. Then he dialed someone's number and waited, and not only tension, but also anxiety flew in the air, but no one answered, even him. Mr. Michael stood up and said that he would go find something and let them sit here for now so that nothing happens. James, seeing their tension, jumped up from his chair and asked permission to find her, and said that he roughly knew where her location was, and the elders, in turn, were surprised. He promised that he would return her home healthy and safe. Then Jordan said that Richard was with him for even greater safety. Coming out of the mansion, the man only told him to sit down and nothing else, thereby surprising the protagonist with his calmness. When they got into the car, without even waiting for James to buckle up, Richard took off, telling the guy to show him the way. At the same time, Mary was on a mission and spoke into the earpiece that she and her partner had arrived, and those around the criminal were careful. She also added that he is armed and dangerous, but he must be caught at any cost, then they will have information. Having finished speaking, the girl and her subordinate began to rise to the door opposite which they stood and knocked. Meanwhile, the bandit was sitting with fake things laid out on the table and talking on the phone. Having finished speaking, he lit a cigarette and went into the game to kill time, and at the same moment there was a knock on the door, thereby frightening the man. Walking up to the door, he looked into the pupil and reached behind his back, where he had a gun, and in case of an attack, he would be ready. Seeing a pretty girl in uniform holding a tablet with papers, he was very surprised and wondered why she had come. Holding the gun in one hand and opening the other, the criminal began to go through all sorts of options for who this cutie was. Meanwhile, Richard and James hurried at all speeds to the girl, hoping that everything was okay with her. The main character checked what the chance of risking the cutie's life was. The system gave an even higher percentage than before, thereby making him worry more and more. Entering the apartment, Mary introduced herself that she had come to check the water supply and that it would not take much time. Looking with a little lust in his eyes, the man said that she could take her time and that she definitely needed to check. But he did not have time to finish because the girl threw her cap at him, thereby discouraging the criminal. Then she kicked him in the face with a scream, throwing him to the other side of the room. The man hit the floor with a dull sound and began to frantically think about how he should now deal with such a situation. James and Richard had already turned into the courtyard of high-rise buildings and practically knocked down people passing by. Mary and her partner rushed at the criminal with handcuffs and almost reached him when the following suddenly happened. The man tightened his grip on the pistol he had been holding all this time, pointed the muzzle directly at the girl and fired. The cutie, seeing this, knocked down her partner, thereby saving him from possible death while greatly risking herself. Taking advantage of the situation, the criminal quickly ran to the window and climbed over it, after which he jumped off. Mary, not far behind, rushed after him there, shouting that he would not escape justice. It was a small floor, so neither the criminal nor Mary were hurt, but when they saw that the tail quickly stood up behind him, and he shot right at her, saying that he had been hiding before, he could hide, and now there was no need to try to catch him. But the bullets did not reach the girl, because she was covered by a car with her brother and James that arrived in time, saving her at the same time. The car drove so close to the criminal that Richard was able to sharply open the door and knock the gun out of his hands. Having knocked the man down, he put his hands behind his back, and the police rushed towards them to arrest their attacker. Mary said he was under arrest and had the right to remain silent, and then handcuffed him. After the incident, the girl greeted her older brother nicely and asked why he appeared here, but noticing James, her face took on a look of dissatisfaction. Meanwhile, the main character was trying to catch his breath from such a harsh driving style and the sounds of gunfire, because his life clearly did not prepare him for this. Richard, not paying attention to the young man, replied that they wanted to see her progress, and noted that if not for James's abilities, they would not have been able to avoid sad consequences. Mary grabbed both of them by the forearm and began to scold them for such a reckless and dangerous act, and that they should not get involved in such adventures at all. But a voice was heard in her earphone, and thanking her for her help, she left to resolve the issues that had arisen, and the main character exhaled with relief. Although, remembering that day when she almost dragged him to the police station for suspicion, thousands of goosebumps ran throughout her body. But the guy was grateful to his luck and the system, which had once again helped and saved him, and took out a cigarette. Having lit a cigarette, he released not only a cloud of smoke, but also relief that everything had turned out okay, and checked what the chance of danger for the girl was now. But the system already returned 85% to his request. The guy was so amazed that he didn't notice how he dropped the cigarette from his hands. Seeing this, James, forgetting about everything, rushed to the entrance where they were standing, and the surprised Richard, without asking anything, followed him. They had already rushed a couple of floors, and the system was increasing the percentage of danger to Mary's life. And his heart was pounding wildly, both from fear and from running. Seeing that the percentage had increased to 90, he gathered his last strength and rushed to the rescue, and Richard already understood what was happening, so he did not speak again. The main character burst into the apartment and loudly called Mary, thereby greatly surprising her and her assistants, who were investigating the case together. They only showed a little surprise on their faces, and James, seeing that there was nothing so threatening, only frowned a little. One of the police officers said that the criminal has accomplices, since he was only an intermediary in the resale of antiques and is now most likely in hiding. Mary once again noted that he had a gun and replied that it was quite dangerous, and ordered that any personnel who seemed suspicious be kept under surveillance. And the system, meanwhile, continued to increase the percentage of the probability of the girl's death. It had already reached 91, which made James very worried. Pushing the guys out of the apartment, the girl warned them not to let this happen next time and ordered her subordinates to go ahead. The main character didn't want to ignore the possibility of her death, so he said that he was staying to help her because she was too relaxed and might lose control of the situation. After listening to him, Mary agreed to his help and asked him to take the matter seriously because the situation was an emergency and anything could happen. James was surprised that she immediately accepted him as an ally and began to look at the table where there were fake antiques and half-eaten food in boxes. Seeing an empty pack of cigarettes, He assumed that the criminal would first go to the nearest supermarket to get them and then disappear, after which Mary grabbed him and the three of them rushed in search. Seeing the risk percentages, the main character said that perhaps civilians could get hurt, and the fugitive realized that they were already looking for him. They flew out of the entrance, and Mary received a message on her earpiece that he had been found and confirmed the young man's words about a probable escape. Having reached the car, the girl said that since casualties were likely, he would protect civilians. When everyone was seated, the cutie quickly buckled up and pressed the gas pedal without waiting for others to do so, and they took off. Due to the high speed that the car developed, when turning, James dangled like jelly and slammed his face into the window. The entire campaign reached the building under construction and entered its territory without hesitation, because every minute was important. Having stopped, the protagonist's stomach could not withstand such adventures. He pushed out everything that his owner had eaten before. Having made sure that he was no longer in danger, Richard asked him to stay here, and he himself went after his sister. The system showed that now there was no threat to Mary's life, and it was zero. The young man, exhaling, decided to light a cigarette to calm his nerves. Before he could take out the lighter, something flew into his head, and when he turned to look where it came from, the guy saw a boy with a teddy bear, thereby being surprised that he was there. Meanwhile, I Will Transfer jumped over the fence and ran towards the construction site, and James tried to stop him with his screams, which had no effect. Seeing a notification from the system that there was a risk to Mary's life again, and this boy could become a hostage, the main character immediately rushed after him to prevent everything. The boy suddenly stopped laughing and running away because a huge man, compared to him, with a pistol stood in his way. He had a smile that did not bode well for him, and the child meanwhile fell into a stupor in front of him, not knowing what to do. Then Mary and Richard arrived. When they saw the two of them, the girl, without thinking about anything, rushed to save the baby. The man also did not hesitate and headed towards the child. But none of them got to the boy because James grabbed him first, thereby saving him. The main character fell on his back, and it seemed to him that something crunched in him. But most likely, he really felt it from the blow, and the system began spamming red signs with the word error, scaring the guy even more, fearing that he would now die faster than Mary. As it turned out, he simply lost consciousness, and when he came to, he was sitting in the car and rubbing the back of his head, which was very painful after the blow. He heard the voice of a girl who praised him for his courage and said that the criminals had already all been captured and arrested. Mary also added that if it were not for his help, then perhaps the matter would have gone on for a long time, and said about the child that he was fine and delivered to his parents. When James fell, he did not open his eyes for a long time. She began to worry that he had somehow died, but Richard reassured her, saying that he was simply unconscious. Seeing that he was slow to think, Mary shouted at him, thereby scaring him, and before the eyes of the main character, there were still signs with an error,